The sound of the cane hitting against the wooden floor echoed throughout the house like a funeral drum. Tap, tap, tap. Esperanza Morales walked slowly down the hallway of her home, the same hallway where her 3 children had run barefoot when they were little, where she had hung their school drawings, where she had comforted them when they came crying from some mischief. Now, at 78 years old, that same hallway felt infinitely long and painfully empty. "Mom, are you ready yet?" Roberto's voice, her eldest son, came from the living room. His tone was impatient, like when he was a child wanting to go out and play while she asked him to finish his homework first. Esperanza stopped in front of the hallway mirror, the same one where she had combed Carmen's hair for her first communion, where she had helped Daniel fix his tie for graduation. Her reflection looked back at her with tired eyes, sunken in a face furrowed with wrinkles that told the story of a life completely dedicated to others. "I'm coming, Mijo," she responded with a voice that tried to sound firm, but cracked slightly at the edges. The fall had been 3 weeks ago. A dizzy spell in the kitchen, a false step, and suddenly she found herself on the floor next to the stove, with her hip screaming in pain. Mrs. Hernandez, her lifelong neighbor, had been the one to find her 2 hours later when she came to bring the sweet bread she bought every Friday. "My God, Esperanza, what happened?" Mercedes Hernandez had screamed upon seeing her on the floor, conscious but unable to get up. What followed was a whirlwind of ambulances, hospitals, doctors with serious faces speaking in medical terms that sounded like death sentences. Hip fracture. Surgery. Rehabilitation. Special care. Her children arrived at the hospital like an avalanche of concern, or at least that's how it seemed at first. Roberto, 52 years old, arrived first. Dressed in his executive suit, smelling of expensive cologne and with his cell phone glued to his ear even as he entered the hospital room. He was director of a construction company, had achieved everything Esperanza had dreamed for him when she worked double shifts to pay for his engineering studies. "Mom, how do you feel?" he had asked, but his eyes were already evaluating the monitors, calculating costs, measuring inconveniences. Carmen arrived an hour later, her heels clicking down the hospital corridor like small hammers. At 49, she was a bank manager, always impeccably dressed, always in a hurry. She had 2 teenage children who barely knew their grandmother because they were too busy with their extracurricular activities. "Oh, Mom, you gave us such a scare," Carmen said, but while she spoke she was already checking her phone, responding to messages, dividing her attention between her injured mother and her work emergencies. Daniel, the youngest, arrived at the end of the day. At 45, he was the most successful of the 3, a lawyer specializing in real estate, with a house in the suburbs and a car that cost more than Esperanza had earned in 5 years of work. But he was also the most distant, the one who visited her least, the one who always had important commitments when she needed something. "Hi, Mom," he said, kissing her quickly on the forehead. "Sorry I'm late, I had a meeting I couldn't cancel." During the 10 days she was hospitalized, Esperanza began to notice things she had previously ignored or justified. Her children's visits became shorter each day. Conversations revolved more around her situation than her well-being. They spoke to each other in whispers in the hallways, stopping their conversations when she approached or when a nurse entered. "We need to talk about the options," Roberto had said on the 7th day, while Carmen and Daniel nodded with grave expressions. "What options?" asked Esperanza, although deep in her heart she already knew where the conversation was heading. "Well, Mom," Carmen cleared her throat in that way she'd had since childhood when she was about to say something she knew wouldn't be pleasant to hear. "The doctors say you need special care during recovery. Daily physical therapy, help bathing, cooking." "I can take care of myself," Esperanza interrupted. "I've been doing it for 15 years, since your father died." "But Mom," Daniel intervened with his lawyer voice, the one he used to convince judges, "now it's different. You're 78 years old. This fall is a sign that you need more help. And can't you help me?" The question came out with more pain than Esperanza had intended to show. An uncomfortable silence fell. Roberto looked out the window. Carmen studied her perfectly manicured nails. Daniel checked his phone. "Mom, you know we'd love to," Roberto finally said, "but our lives are very complicated now. I have the company, Carmen has the bank, Daniel has his legal cases. And we have our own families to take care of," Carmen added. "My kids are at a difficult age, they need all my attention. Besides," Daniel closed the argument with surgical precision, "what would happen if you fall again and there's no one to help you? What would happen if something happens to you and we're not there?" Esperanza looked at the 3 of them, these successful men and women who had once been babies in her arms, children who cried in her lap when they had nightmares, teenagers who came to her with their love problems and future dreams. "Do you already have a place in mind?" she asked in a voice so low it was barely heard. We've researched several places, Roberto said quickly, as if he'd been waiting for the question. There's one called Sunset Gardens, it's very well rated. It has beautiful gardens, activities for residents, nurses 24 hours a day. Residents? The word came out like a moan. Well, yes, Mom. It's a home for seniors. But it's not like the old nursing homes. It's more like a community. Esperanza closed her eyes. She knew what those communities were. She had visited enough of them as a nurse to know that no matter how beautiful the gardens were or how kind the nurses were, they were still places where families left their elderly when they became inconvenient. Is it temporary? She asked, clinging to one last hope. Of course, Mom, Carmen said too quickly. Just until you recover completely. But Esperanza had raised these 3 children. She had changed their diapers, cleaned their vomit, watched over their fevers, dried their tears. She knew each of their gestures, every inflection of their voices, every little lie they had learned to tell to avoid trouble. And she knew, with the painful clarity that only comes with experience, that there was nothing temporary about what they were planning. That night, alone in her hospital bed, Esperanza didn't sleep. Instead, she remembered. She remembered when Roberto was 7 years old and got pneumonia. She had missed work for a whole week to take care of him, losing a salary she desperately needed. She remembered how she sat by his bed every night, putting wet cloths on his forehead, singing lullabies until he fell asleep. She remembered when Carmen was 15 and came home crying because her little boyfriend had left her for another girl. Esperanza had cancelled an important appointment with the accountant to stay with her, making her hot chocolate and listening to her cry until 3 in the morning. She remembered when Daniel, fresh out of college, couldn't find a job and had become so depressed that he wouldn't even leave his room. Esperanza had used her savings to pay for a professional update course, and had cooked his favorite dishes every day until he regained confidence in himself. She remembered 1,000 sleepless nights when they had fever, 1,000 days without lunch so they could eat, 1,000 small and large sacrifices she had made without thinking twice because that's what mothers did. And now, when she was the one who needed care, when it was her turn to be vulnerable, they had found the most convenient way to deal with the situation: pay for someone else to take care of it. The following days passed in a haze of preparations. Roberto took care of the legal and financial procedures. Carmen organized the move of the essential things that Esperanza could take to the nursing home. Daniel reviewed all the documents to make sure everything was in order. Esperanza felt like a spectator in her own life, watching her children efficiently organize her exile. Mom, you can only take the basics, Carmen explained while going through her closet. The room isn't very big, and besides, everything you need will be there. Esperanza watched as Carmen separated her dresses into 2 piles, a small one to take, a large one to donate to charity. Among the dresses destined for charity was the blue dress she had worn to Roberto's wedding, the black dress she had bought for her husband's funeral, the flowered dress she had put on for Daniel's graduation. Can I take the photos? She asked. Some, Carmen responded without looking up. But not all. There's no space. Esperanza observed the walls of her room, covered with decades of photographic memories. Photos of birthdays, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. Each image told a story, marked an important moment in her family's life. How could she choose only some? What about my books? She asked. Esperanza had been a voracious reader all her life, and had a small personal library that she had been building book by book for years. Mom, you won't need so many books, Carmen said in a tone used to talk to a child. Besides, they probably have a library there. But Esperanza knew it wasn't the same. Those books had her notes in the margins, her handmade bookmarks, their dedications. They were like old friends who had accompanied her during lonely nights and quiet afternoons. The day before the move, Esperanza sat in her living room for the last time. It was the same living room where she had taught her children to walk, where she had helped with homework, where she had received their boyfriends and girlfriends, where she had organized Christmas family gatherings. The furniture was still there, but somehow it no longer felt like her home. It felt like a museum of a life that had ended, like an abandoned stage after the play had finished. Roberto entered with a cup of coffee, but not for her. For him. How do you feel, Mom? He asked, but he was already checking his phone while speaking. Scared, Esperanza responded with an honesty that surprised even herself. Roberto looked up for the first time. Scared of what? Of being alone. Of being forgotten. Of dying among strangers. Roberto approached and put a hand on her shoulder, but the gesture felt mechanical, like something he knew he should do but not something that arose naturally. Mom, you won't be alone. You'll be surrounded by people your age, with similar interests. And we're going to visit you all the time. All the time? Asked Esperanza. Well, every weekend. Or at least every 2 weeks. Depending on our schedules. Esperanza nodded, but in her heart she knew that, depending on our schedules, meant that visits would become less and less frequent until they eventually stopped completely. That night, for the first time in weeks, Carmen stayed for dinner with her. They had ordered Chinese food, something they used to do when Carmen was a teenager, and they had girls' nights while Roberto and Daniel were at their sports activities. Do you remember when we used to do this? Asked Esperanza, pointing to the food containers. Carmen smiled, but it was a nostalgic and sad smile. Yes, I remember. You always ordered sweet and sour chicken and I always wanted chow mein. And you always ended up eating my chicken too, Esperanza added, and for a moment, just for a moment, it felt like she had her daughter back. Mom, Carmen said after a silence, I know this is difficult. But we really think it's the best for you. The best for me, or the most convenient for you? The question came out before Esperanza could stop it. Carmen fell silent, moving the chow mein with her chopsticks without bringing it to her mouth. Mom, it's not that we don't want to take care of you. It's that we don't know how. Our lives are so different from yours when we were children. You could stay home, you could be available 24 hours. We have demanding jobs, mortgages, children of our own. I also had demanding jobs, Esperanza said softly. I worked double shifts at the hospital. But I never considered you a burden. It's not that we think you're a burden, Carmen hurried to say. It's that we're afraid of not being able to give you the care you need. What if you fall again and we're not there? What if you need medical help and we don't know what to do? Esperanza looked at her daughter, saw the genuine conflict in her eyes, and for a moment felt compassion for her. Maybe they really believed they were doing the right thing. Maybe they really thought that a professional nursing home was better than the amateur care they could provide. But that didn't make it hurt any less. What if I don't adapt? Asked Esperanza. What if I don't like being there? You'll adapt, Mom. You're strong. You've always been strong. But Esperanza knew there was a difference between being strong by choice and being strong by necessity. She had been strong when her husband died because she had to be, because she had children who depended on her. She had been strong when she worked double shifts because she had to be, because she had a family to feed. Now they were asking her to be strong for her own emotional survival, and she wasn't sure she had that strength. The morning of the move arrived with light rain that seemed to cry for her. Esperanza woke up early, before the alarm sounded, and lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of her house, the creaking of the wood, the humming of the refrigerator, the dripping of the kitchen faucet that she had never managed to fix completely. They were sounds she had heard for more than 40 years, sounds that had become the soundtrack of her life. In a few hours, they would be replaced by different sounds, voices of strangers, medical equipment, the footsteps of nurses down hallways she didn't know. She got up slowly, using the cane that was now her constant companion, and went to the kitchen. She prepared coffee as she had done thousands of times before, but this time each movement felt ceremonial, as if she were performing a ritual for the last time. While the coffee was brewing, she looked out the window toward the garden she had cared for during decades. The roses she had planted when Roberto was born were now large, lush bushes. The lemon tree she had planted to celebrate Carmen's first steps now provided shade to half the patio. The small vegetable garden where she had taught Daniel to plant carrots was now abandoned, but she could still see the furrows where they had once worked together. Who would take care of her garden now? Roberto arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, punctual as always. He brought with him 2 men in uniforms from a moving company, but he also brought that expression of business efficiency that Esperanza had learned to fear. Good morning, Mom. Ready? How could she be ready to leave the life she had built, the memories she had accumulated, the home she had created with so much love and sacrifice? I suppose so, she responded, because there was no other possible answer. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of activity. The moving men packed the few belongings that Esperanza had been authorized to take, some clothes, some selected photos, a few books, her medicines, and little more. Carmen arrived with a new suitcase. I bought you this so you'd have something nice to pack your things in, she said, but even this kind gesture felt like a farewell. Daniel arrived last, as always, with papers in hand. Mom, I need you to sign some documents. They're for medical insurance and to authorize treatments in case of emergency. Esperanza signed without reading, because what else could she do? She had already lost control over her life, the bureaucratic details seemed irrelevant. When everything was packed, a strange silence fell over the house. The 4 of them stood in the living room, as if no one knew what to do next. Well, Roberto finally said, I guess it's time to go. Esperanza looked one last time at the living room where she had lived so many important moments. The sofa where she had breastfed her babies. The table where they had dined as a family for years. The window from which she had watched her children leave every morning for school, and from which she had waited for their return every afternoon. "Can I have a minute alone?" she asked. Her children exchanged glances. "Mom, we don't want to be late," Carmen said. "They have your arrival scheduled for 11. "Just 1 minute," Esperanza insisted. They went out to the patio, and Esperanza was left alone in her house for the last time. She walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, breathing the familiar air, trying to memorize every detail. In her bedroom, she stopped in front of the dresser where she kept her jewelry. She opened the top drawer and took out a small blue velvet box. Inside was her wedding ring, which she had taken off after her husband's death because it hurt too much to wear it. She put it on her finger, where it felt strange after so many years, but also familiar, like an echo of who she had been before becoming just Mom, and then, the elderly woman who needs special care. "Forgive me, love," she whispered, speaking to her dead husband. "I don't know if I did well raising our children. I don't know where we went wrong." When she left the house, her children were waiting for her by the car. Roberto had the keys in his hand. Carmen was checking her phone. Daniel was talking on the phone with someone about a legal case. None of them seemed to understand the magnitude of what was happening. For them, it was a logistical problem they were solving efficiently. For her, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another she hadn't chosen. The trip to the nursing home was silent. Esperanza sat in the back seat, watching her neighborhood fade away through the window. They passed the store where she had bought food for decades, the church where she had baptized her children, the park where she had taken them to play when they were little. Each familiar place they left behind felt like a small death. Sunset Gardens had a beautiful name and a well-maintained exterior. There were, indeed, gardens, although they were designed more to be seen than to be enjoyed. It was the type of place that looked good in brochures and that reassured families who needed to feel good about their decisions. The administrator, a middle-aged woman with a professional smile, received them in the lobby. "Mrs. Morales. What a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Linda Ramirez, the director. Your children have told me so much about you." Esperanza wondered what exactly they had said. That she was a burden. That she needed to be managed. That they wanted the most convenient solution. "Would you like to see your room?" asked Linda with rehearsed enthusiasm. The room was small but clean. It had a single bed, a small closet, a chair by the window, and a private bathroom. It was functional, nothing more. There was no space for a lifetime of memories, for treasures accumulated over decades, for the things that made a place feel like home. "What do you think?" asked Roberto. "It's fine," Esperanza responded, because what else could she say? The next few minutes were a blur of forms, instructions about meal times, explanations about available activities, and introductions to staff members. Esperanza nodded and smiled when appropriate, but she felt like she was watching everything from outside her body. When the time came for goodbyes, her children hugged her one by one. They were quick, uncomfortable hugs, like those given at funerals between people who don't know each other well. "We'll call you tomorrow," Carmen promised. "We'll come this weekend," Daniel added. "If you need anything, just tell Linda," Roberto said. And then they left, walking quickly toward the parking lot as if they wanted to escape before they changed their minds or before the weight of what they had done caught up with them. Esperanza stood at the window of her new room, watching Roberto's car drive away. When she could no longer see it, she continued standing there, looking toward the outside world that now felt as distant as if she were on another planet. "Mrs. Morales?" Linda's voice startled her. "Would you like me to show you the dining room? It's almost lunchtime." Esperanza turned toward this strange woman in this strange place that was now supposed to be her home. "Yes," she said in a voice she didn't recognize as her own. "I suppose so." As she walked through the nursing home hallways, passing other elderly people in wheelchairs, other elderly people lost in their own worlds of loneliness and abandonment, Esperanza thought about the cruel irony of the situation. She had spent her entire life taking care of others. She had sacrificed her own dreams, her own needs, her own ambitions to make sure her children had everything they needed to succeed in life. And they had succeeded. They were successful, prosperous, respected in their communities. But in the process of teaching them to succeed in the world, she had forgotten to teach them to love unconditionally. She had forgotten to teach them that success without compassion was empty, that prosperity without loyalty was hollow, that professional respect without family love was a Pyrrhic victory. Now she was paying the price of her own success as a mother. She had raised children who knew how to solve problems, but didn't know how to embrace pain. She had raised children who knew how to be efficient, but didn't know how to be devoted. She had raised children who knew how to be successful, but didn't know how to be children. As she sat in the nursing home dining room, surrounded by strangers who shared her same destiny of abandonment, Esperanza wondered if her children would ever realize what they had lost. They hadn't just lost her. They had lost the opportunity to show that the love she had given them hadn't been in vain. They had lost the opportunity to be the people she had dreamed they would become when she rocked them in her arms as babies. They had lost the opportunity to be truly successful in the only measure that really mattered, the measure of the heart. But maybe, she thought while looking at the tasteless food on her plate, maybe they would never realize. Maybe they would continue living their busy and prosperous lives, convincing themselves that they had done the right thing, that they had been responsible children, that they had made the difficult but necessary decision. Maybe they would never understand that there was a difference between being responsible and being loving, between being practical and being devoted, between solving a problem and honoring a relationship. Or maybe, just maybe, someday they would realize what they had done. And when that day came, it would be too late to change anything, but not too late for them to feel the full weight of their choice. Esperanza finished her first lunch at the nursing home and prepared to begin her new life as a resident of Sunset Gardens, not knowing that this new life would be much shorter than any of them imagined. 3 days later, Roberto Morales was driving down the highway with his hands firmly gripping the steering wheel, but his mind was elsewhere. In the passenger seat, Carmen was obsessively checking her phone, and in the back seat, Daniel was looking out the window with an expression he hadn't had since he was a child and had accidentally broken his mother's favorite vase. They had received the call that morning. A call that would change their lives forever, though they didn't know it yet. Mr. Morales, the professional but compassionate voice of Linda Ramirez from the nursing home had said. "I'm very sorry to inform you that your mother suffered a massive heart attack during the early morning." The world had stopped for Roberto at that moment. We're very sorry. We did everything we could, but it was too late when she got to the hospital. She passed away at 3:47 in the morning. The following hours had been a whirlwind of phone calls, funeral arrangements, and a guilt that none of the 3 siblings wanted to admit but that was eating them from the inside like acid. Esperanza Morales had died alone, in a strange place, surrounded by strangers, whispering her children's names according to what the night nurse had told them. She kept saying Roberto, Carmen, Daniel, until the end, the nurse had told them with tears in her eyes. I think she was waiting for them, but they hadn't been there. Roberto had been at a business dinner. Carmen had been at a parent-teacher meeting at her children's school. Daniel had been working late on a case that couldn't wait. None of them had visited their mother in the 3 days she had been at the nursing home. The promised daily calls had become a group text that said, "We hope she's well, we'll visit soon." Soon never came. Now they were driving to their mother's house to begin the process of cleaning it and preparing it for sale. It was the practical thing to do, the efficient thing, what any responsible person would do in these circumstances. But none of them had slept the night before. "Do you remember the last time we were all together in the house?" Carmen suddenly asked, breaking the silence that had dominated the trip. "Last Christmas," Daniel responded with a hoarse voice. "Mom had cooked for 2 days. She made mole, tamales, punch. And we arrived late," Roberto added, his voice loaded with regret that came too late. "I had to take a call during dinner. And I left early because the kids had to get up early the next day," Carmen murmured. "And I didn't even stay to help with the dishes," Daniel finished. They fell back into silence, each lost in their own memories and regrets. When they arrived at the house, Roberto stayed seated in the car for a moment, looking at the familiar facade. It looked exactly the same as always, but somehow it also looked completely different. It looked empty. As if the house knew that its soul had gone forever. "Well," he finally said, "I guess we should go in." Carmen was the first to get out of the car, but she stopped at the entrance, with the key in her hand, as if she couldn't decide to open it. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked. "It's just that, once we go in, it'll be real. It'll be really real that she's gone." Roberto put a hand on his sister's shoulder. "It's already real, Carmen. It's been real since this morning." Carmen nodded, took a deep breath, and opened the door. What they saw left them completely paralyzed. The house didn't look like they had left it 3 days ago. It didn't look like the house where they had grown up. It didn't look like any place they had ever seen in their lives. Every wall, from floor to ceiling, was completely covered with bills. Thousands and thousands of bills meticulously taped down, creating a mosaic of money that covered every vertical surface in the house. "What the hell?" Roberto murmured, his voice barely a whisper. The bills were of different denominations, $20, $50, $100. Some were new and crisp, others were worn and soft from use. Some had small handwritten notes in the margins with their mother's trembling handwriting. Daniel approached the nearest wall and read one of the notes, extra shift, March 15, 1987, for Roberto's new shoes. Carmen ran to the kitchen and screamed. The walls there were also lined with bills, but these had different notes, weekend work, April 1989, for Carmen's graduation dress. Roberto followed his siblings to the hallway, his legs moving automatically while his mind tried to process what he was seeing. In the hallway, the bills had notes that said things like, double shift at Christmas, 1992, for Daniel's bicycle, and extra private nurse work, summer 1994, for Daniel's camp. This has to be a joke, Carmen whispered, but her voice was breaking as she spoke. This can't be real. But it was real. Terribly, devastatingly real. Daniel began peeling off some bills with trembling hands, as if he couldn't believe they were authentic. They were real. Each one of them. Roberto, Carmen screamed from the living room, come here. Now. Roberto ran to the living room, where Carmen was standing in front of a wall that had a special section. This section had framed bills with longer notes written on paper and pasted next to them. Roberto read the first note aloud, his voice breaking with each word. This is the money I earned working on my 45th birthday. Roberto was 18 years old and needed money for his first semester at university. Instead of celebrating my birthday, I worked a double shift to be able to pay for his books. It's worth every penny when I see how proud I am of him. Carmen, read the next one. This money comes from working 3 shifts in a row when Carmen was in the hospital with appendicitis. She needed to stay with me, but I also needed to pay the medical bills that insurance didn't cover. Sleep is optional when your daughter needs you. Daniel approached with tears running down his cheeks and read the third. This is the money I saved by skipping meals for 2 months to be able to buy Daniel his first computer. He said he needed it for school, and I knew he was right. My stomach can wait, my son's future cannot. They continued reading note after note, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Money earned working on New Year's instead of being with my family, to be able to pay for Carmen's piano lessons. Money saved by not buying medicine for my arthritis, to be able to buy Roberto's graduation suit. Money earned working with a fever of 102 degrees, to be able to pay Daniel's bail when he had problems at university. Each note was a dagger to the heart, each bill was evidence of a sacrifice they had never known their mother had made. But the worst was yet to come. In their mother's bedroom they found a table with envelopes. Dozens of envelopes with their names written in Esperanza's familiar handwriting. The envelopes were organized by years, 1985, 1990, 1995, 2000, 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020, 2024. With trembling hands, Roberto opened the envelope marked Roberto, 1987. My dear Roberto, today you turned 20. I worked an extra shift to be able to buy you that leather jacket you wanted so much. I saw you looking at it in the shop window for weeks. It costs $180, which is exactly what I earned working the Friday night shift. I didn't tell you I worked extra to pay for it because I wanted you to feel like you deserved it simply for being my wonderful son. With all my love, Mom. Carmen opened one of hers from 1992. My dear Carmen, tomorrow is your graduation dance. I know all your friends have expensive dresses, and I didn't want you to feel different. I worked cleaning offices after my regular shifts for 2 months to be able to buy you that blue dress you saw in the store. When I saw you smile trying it on, I knew every extra hour had been worth it. Your mom who adores you, Esperanza. Daniel, with tears flowing freely down his face, opened the most recent envelope with his name, dated just the month before. My dear Daniel, tomorrow you turn 45. You're already a successful man with your own family, but to me you'll always be my baby. I've been saving money for years to be able to leave you something when I'm gone. I don't know when that day will be, but I want you to know that every dollar I didn't spend on myself I saved thinking about your future and your siblings' future. I've worked all my life to give you everything you needed. Now that I'm old and can no longer work, it gives me peace to know that at least I'll be able to leave you something so you remember how much I loved you. Your mom forever, Esperanza. But the envelope that completely destroyed them was the last one they found. It was in the center of the table, larger than the others, with, my 3 children, written in large, careful letters. Roberto opened it with hands that trembled so much he could barely hold the paper. Asterisk Roberto, Carmen and Daniel, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer with you. It also means you've come to the house and have seen what I've done with the walls. I know you must be confused, maybe even upset. Let me explain. Throughout my entire life, every dollar I earned working, every penny I saved by sacrificing something for myself, I did it thinking of you. On these walls there is exactly $847,000. It's the money from a lifetime of work, of sacrifice, of love. Every bill represents a meal I didn't eat so you could eat better. Every bill represents a night I worked extra instead of resting so you could have what you needed. Every bill represents a dream of mine I postponed so you could fulfill yours. I never told you about these savings because I wanted you to learn the value of hard work. I planned to divide this money among you when I died, so you would have something to help you in your lives, something that represented all the love I felt for you during all these years. But then something happened that I never expected. When I needed you most, when the time finally came when I was the one who needed care, you abandoned me. It wasn't the fall that broke my heart. It wasn't the hospitalization. It wasn't even the idea of needing help. It was realizing that the children for whom I sacrificed everything, the children to whom I dedicated every moment of my life, the children who were my entire reason for existing, saw me as a burden to be gotten rid of. I went to that place you chose for me, hoping it would be temporary as you promised. I waited for your visits that never came. I waited for your calls that became increasingly rare. I waited for signs that you missed me, that I still mattered in your lives. But they never came. In those last days, I understood something terrible. I had raised successful children, but I hadn't raised loving children. I had taught you to work hard, but I hadn't taught you to care. I had given you everything you needed to succeed in the world, but I had failed to teach you what it meant to be family. And that's my fault, not yours. You can keep this money if you want. Legally, it's yours. But I want you to know that every time you look at it, every time you spend it, you'll remember that it comes from a mother who loved you more than she loved her own life, and who died feeling abandoned by the only people who truly mattered to her. Or you can donate it, if carrying it feels too heavy. Or you can burn it, if that helps you forget. But there's one thing you can't do, you can't erase the fact that when I had the chance to show you my love, I did it throughout my entire life. And when you had the chance to show me yours, you sent me away. Money is just paper. Love is what makes it valuable. And without love, these $847,000 are worth nothing. I forgive you, because that's what mothers do. But I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive yourselves. With all the love my broken heart can still contain. Your mother, who loved you until her last breath. Esperanza Morales. P.S. In the garden, under the lemon tree I planted when Daniel was born, you'll find a box. Inside there's something else I want you to have. Asterisk. The three siblings remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The weight of their mother's words filled the room like toxic smoke, making it difficult to breathe. Finally, Daniel got up like a zombie and walked toward the garden. Roberto and Carmen followed him in silence. Under the lemon tree, they dug with their own hands until they found a small metal box. Inside were photos. Hundreds of photos that Esperanza had taken without them noticing throughout the years. Photos of Roberto sleeping on the couch after studying all night for his final exams, with a blanket their mother had put over him. Photos of Carmen practicing for a school play, with Esperanza sitting in the front row of the empty auditorium, being her only audience. Photos of Daniel building a house of cards on the kitchen table, with Esperanza watching from the doorway with a smile of pride. Photos of the three of them together at Christmas, birthdays, graduations, but all taken from the perspective of someone who was watching from outside, from the margins, from the place where mothers observe their children live their lives. And at the bottom of the box, one last note. These are my favorite photos of you. I took them without you noticing because I wanted to capture who you really were when you thought no one was watching. In all these photos, you are perfect. You are my perfect children, and I was the proudest mother in the world. I wanted you to have them so you would remember that there was a time when I was the happiest person in the world simply for being your mom. Roberto collapsed next to the tree and began to cry like he hadn't cried since he was a child. Carmen knelt next to him, sobbing uncontrollably. Daniel hugged his siblings, and the three cried together for the first time in decades. They cried for their mother, for her wasted love, for lost opportunities, for words never said, for hugs never given, for "I love yous" they had taken for granted until there were no more. But above all, they cried for the devastating realization that they had had a treasure, the unconditional love of a mother, and they had treated it as if it were a burden. Now they had $847,000, but they had lost something priceless, the opportunity to be the children their mother deserved. When they finally stopped crying, when they had no more tears left, they sat in the garden where they had once played as children, surrounded by the money that represented a lifetime of maternal sacrifices. "What are we going to do?" asked Carmen with a hoarse voice. "I don't know," Roberto responded. "How do you live with something like this?" "You don't live," Daniel said. "You survive. And you try to be better." They stayed there until it got dark, three successful adults who had just learned the difference between being rich and being blessed, between having money and having value, between being successful and being good children. When they finally got up to leave, Roberto looked toward the house one last time. "We're going to turn this house into something special," he said. "A home for single mothers. A place where women like Mom can receive help. And we're going to use every penny of this money for that," Carmen added. "And we're going to call it Casa Esperanza," Daniel finished. They couldn't bring their mother back. They couldn't erase their abandonment. They couldn't change the fact that she had died alone, whispering their names. But they could honor her memory by making sure her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. They could use her money, every dollar earned with love, to help other mothers who needed it. It was the least they could do. It was all they could do. As they drove back to their homes that night, each carrying some of their mother's photos, they knew their lives had changed forever. They had learned, too late, that there are things more valuable than money. They had learned that love has no expiration date. They had learned that being a child is a privilege, not a burden. And they had learned that some lessons are so painful they change your soul forever. The next morning, Roberto quit his executive job to dedicate himself full-time to establishing Casa Esperanza. Carmen took early retirement from the bank to help coordinate the project. Daniel closed his law practice and began working pro bono for families in situations similar to what their mother had faced. They sold their expensive houses and moved into modest apartments, dedicating every resource to the foundation. The $847,000 became the seed money for what would grow into a network of support centers for elderly people abandoned by their families. But they never spent a penny of their mother's money on themselves. Every dollar was sacred, every bill a reminder of the love they had rejected. 5 years later, Casa Esperanza had helped over 3,000 elderly people find dignity, care, and love in their final years. The foundation had grown beyond anything they had imagined, funded not just by their mother's savings but by donations from people who heard Esperanza's story and were moved to help. Roberto, now 57, had never remarried. He lived alone in a small apartment above the main Casa Esperanza facility, dedicating 16 hours a day to the work that had become his penance and his purpose. Carmen, 54, had reconciled with her own children, who had been shocked to learn about their grandmother's story. She made sure they spent every weekend volunteering at Casa Esperanza, learning the value of caring for others. Daniel, 50, had developed a legal aid program specifically for elderly people being abandoned by their families. He worked tirelessly to change laws and protect the rights of the most vulnerable. But despite all their good work, despite all the lives they had touched and saved, they carried the weight of their mother's abandonment every single day. It was a pain that never dulled, a regret that never faded, a lesson learned too late to matter for the one person who had mattered most. On the 5th anniversary of their mother's death, they gathered at her grave for their annual visit. The headstone was simple: Esperanza Morales, beloved mother, her love lives on in every life she touched. "I wonder if she would be proud of what we've built," Carmen said, placing fresh flowers on the grave.